several months might seem like a long time, but actually the alternative, and some of the quotes that we got within this paper were that it takes a lifetime or many, many years to change your technique. And for some people, actually, the consequences can be that it destroys their career. So, choosing to work on technique is a massive decision. And if you're going to do it, our advice would be to do it properly. You might take some time out or accept bad performances while you're going through the transition.
Welcome to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Howie Carson about long-term player development. I hope you enjoy.
So what we were interested in doing was extending this first study where we looked at the lesson T. Okay, so we know that, or we found that coaches tended to have less of an influence between the lesson T and going into a competition. But we needed and wanted to understand the bigger picture. Okay, so we were looking at technical training. Okay, because the players were working on technique, and this is a very common aspect of training in golf, as I'm sure you all know, because it's very important. So we wanted to sort of zoom out, okay, and take a look at a whole season's worth of play. Okay, so rather than just looking at one instance of training, we wanted to understand, I'll use the phrase, this intention for impact, not only just in a single session, but recognizing that you might not achieve that intention for impact in one lesson, in one session. Sometimes it can take a lot longer. And in fact, some of the best intentions for impact take longer to achieve. Okay, so I mean, if you were to look at somebody learning a skill, so I'm not talking about elite level golfers here, but learners who pick up skills incredibly quickly because the coach makes the training session very easy for them and they just repeat the same skill again and again, they often don't retain those skills the next week, and they often don't go from the lesson tee to the golf course in transferring those skills. So sometimes achieving your intention for impact, be able to do the movement or do the skill very quickly isn't a good thing. And if you design the practice so that the person has to digest and understand the movements and the skill being performed, and you can do that in quite a number of ways, it takes a lot longer for that intention to be achieved. And also you get different outcomes. The person remembers the movement better and they're able to go from the lesson tee to the golf course. But we were looking at elite level golfers in this study, and what we wanted to do was try and understand from the coach's perspective, I guess, their intention for impact when working on technical training with golfers over a season-long period. And so we interviewed them and asked them about the structure of the practice. So we were interested in effectively, so the goals or the intention over the whole season, but then how they structured training into phases to achieve those goals, and then what they did within the lesson to achieve the goal of the phase. So the goals, the structure, and the methods. So what was the goal of each phase? What was the structure? So were there any blocks? And then what were the methods that you used to try and achieve that? And what we found was that coaches pretty much exclusively working with these players were working on changing technique. Okay, so they're working always to try and change and improve the technique in the long term. So that was like the macro level goal. But when we asked them about what we call meso level, so what was the system that you used? What were the phases that would break down in order to achieve that big goal of changing a golfer's technique? There wasn't really a system or an understanding in place. Okay? So, from probably a lot of other areas of psychology, we talk about, outcome and process. So, you've got the outcome that you were trying to achieve, the intention, but there wasn't really a systematic understanding of how to get there. Okay? And this actually reflects a study that I did, and we published in 2013, where we exclusively asked coaches to focus or to tell us about times when they were making a change to a player's technique. Here we were just asking about their technical training. So we weren't asking them specifically, you're working with a player to make a change. That's just what they naturally gravitated towards. Everybody was making a change. And we found also that the systems that were in place were very inconsistent, and there wasn't a complete system. So we're getting evidence to show that long-term technical training isn't very well understood, certainly mechanistically. So how would it work if I wanted to get from A to B? Okay. We also found that the methods that were employed, so the type of coaching, was a bit incoherent. Okay, so people using a mixture of approaches that you may have heard from within the literature. But I suppose our main finding, and most important one, was the value that the coaches placed on long-term planning. So they tended to only address issues in the short term on the basis that golf and the challenges that golfers face are so unpredictable that you can only address what's in front of you. So despite suggesting that they were working towards long-term outcomes, actually their approach was very much focused on the short term.
And if I remember correctly, one of the obstacles that was identified was the tournament schedule. And I think for context, in this paper, elite golfers, it was really, because elite is, what does elite mean? Really, but these were tour level players. So I think that's important to highlight that we're talking about the best of the best. Tournaments being a big obstacle to that because they had these busy schedules and, well, there's no time to really undertake all that. But that was probably, if I wanted to read one of the quotes from that, because that was really struck me. Several coaches expressed a desire for their players to have played less to undertake important technical work. Tournament golf was a quote-unquote distraction. Coach 10, which was one of the coaches in the study, even stressed that valuing those gaps in your year when you are periodizing things to leave space to address these factors in your game is golden time. However, while stressing the importance of this, none of the coaches encouraged their players to remove events and intentionally orchestrate these gaps in their schedule to achieve the aforementioned aims. So when I read that, I thought this was really, really interesting, more so because this is at the highest level. And so if it's not happening at the highest level, chances are it's not exactly being implemented downstream.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why that might be is because of social or financial pressures. I don't know. Maybe players are committed to playing in certain tournaments, or management are dictating or advising on what players, on where players should compete. And if that's not within the remit of the coach, then that's a constraint. We found in the 2013 study that players were often going through cycles of sort of working on their technique and not working on their technique. So they were always in this constant state of flux of trying to control their movements and then firing on all cylinders. But the changes that they were making weren't long lasting. And yeah, I think you see that when we talk about technical change. We do a lot of work on elite golfers or highly skilled golfers, but this also applies to club golfers. The point is that you've got a large amount of experience whereby the movement has become automatized, or as we call well established. Now, whether that's an effective movement or not, the control of the movement is still the same. So, your club golfer trying to fix bad habits still needs a system or a framework in order to take them from that bad habit to one that is able to be more effective and long lasting. So we're seeing similar changes here, similar findings here with the golfers. And a point that we would make is that while systems are out there for making technical change, and it is acknowledged in that literature that it can take time. It can take many months to change a movement pattern, even when done with an effective system. Now, a lot of coaches have said...
I think that alone is a very important point. Even with an effective system, it can take multiple months to make an actual change to some sort of skill. So I think for listeners and golfers thinking, okay, months, okay, that means many, many weeks of repetitively working on the same thing and not getting discouraged if I had a bad day.
You'll inevitably have a bad day, because to change something that you're not aware of, you need to become aware of it, which we know isn't very good for you. We've published many papers on what we call the 5A model, which is a framework designed to change movement patterns that are already well automatized. But the point that I make is that, several months might seem like a long time, but actually the alternative, and some of the quotes that we got within this paper were that it takes a lifetime or many, many years to change your technique. And for some people, actually, the consequences can be that it destroys their career. So, choosing to work on technique is a massive decision. And if you're going to do it, our advice would be to do it properly. So you might take some time out or accept bad performances while you're going through the transition in order to reap the benefits for longer, sooner, rather than being in this constant state.
And basically, at least what I take from that is that to achieve that, having a long-term plan, periodization, which is a concept that's very common in other, disciplines in the world of fitness, having some sort of bit more long-term plan, the macro cycle you talked about, and then those phases is going to, at least in my opinion, make it easier to stay on track and be committed to that. Because like you said, a swing change is a major decision that shouldn't be taken lightly, because it can have potentially very devastating, outcomes if you're trying to make a living playing golf, or even if you're just trying to play at a high level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the balance of what you're trying to achieve as a coach, or your intention for impact, becomes vital. And what it seems is that with these coaches, all of them said trying to work on changing technique. That was the technical training that they were doing with the players. And this is actually where we're going with Stephen, but I won't go into it too much. It's to come. It will be published. But I suppose where we are with coaching is to try to look at the root cause of, a lot of this sort of lack of depth and breadth in understanding, is really to try to understand what sorts of outcomes you might be trying to achieve. Because at the moment it seems that you turn up to the lesson tee and the coach will try to change the way that you move. So you've got a swing fault, I need to fix it. But of course there are lots of other things that a coach needs to consider. So for instance, has the person actually learnt the movement? So is this a learner? Because there's lots of people using theory and evidence about people learning skills for people who've already learnt the skill but need to change the skill. in which case your learning, your outcome or your intention for impact is not appropriate for that client. So it's going back to almost the conceptualization of the challenge. So what is it that I'm trying to achieve? And sometimes you're not necessarily trying to change a skill or change a movement. You're trying to actually stabilize or help the golfer to find the effective movement. Just because a player hits a bad shot doesn't mean they need to change their movement mechanics. Yeah. So working to find the effective movement mechanics, so to stabilize their performance, involves technical training. But the coaches in this study were conceptualizing everything by changing the technique. So what we're trying to do is to work towards providing a more sophisticated understanding of technical work in golf.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying one of the examples you gave there, is this a learner? Meaning, is this someone who is actually in the phase of having to learn the skill that we want them to achieve versus somebody who's in a phase that actually understands what they're trying to do, but it's a matter of actually being able to refine that and be able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, take for instance, so we use the phrase technical change, but actually technical change can be characterized in two different ways. So you might have a highly skilled, highly experienced golfer who has a error in their movement. Now, you might be trying to change that movement to something that they've never done before. So you're trying to evolve the technique in a new direction for that player, which is a big challenge because they've never experienced this sensation before. And as you know, a small change in movement can feel blooming awful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you take an experienced golfer and just change their grip a tiny bit, and the whole movement feels alien to them. So that's a real significant challenge. But within the category of technical change, you might also be trying to what we call regain technique. So somebody might be, for any number of reasons, could be that they've been to a coach, they've been working on something for a very long time. Now they're coming to a new coach, and you're going to work with them to try and improve them. Now, you might try to regain a movement that they've previously been able to do. So taking somebody back to a previous version of technique is not the same as changing their technique to something that they've never done before. You've got to address that whole block of training that they've been doing with the other coach. I mean, it could also be injury, for instance. Yeah, so overcoming an injury might be another reason for trying to regain technique. And again, depending on the reason, it depends, will change your approach and interaction biopsychosocially with the player. Yeah, so working with a player who's had 2 years of duff coaching is very different to a player who's just had a serious injury. Yeah, but you might be trying to achieve the same thing.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so just understanding, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? What's the macro level goal of this training?
And respecting the timeline that it actually, the time that it takes to actually follow that, both on the coaching side
Absolutely.
And on the player. Because on the coaching side, yes, the hard part is, if there's time pressures and constraints and it's a performance-based business models don't necessarily align with how humans learn, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely. And this probably is an influencing factor within our findings. This is the social side of all of this coaching that we're seeing. But that is the reality. So models and frameworks that we've put forward talk about the interaction between the bio, the physical, the psycho, and the social. So yeah, if you've got something that's going to take a very long time and be very difficult for the golfer, you need to make sure that they're aware and able to deal with those challenges, and you've got buy-in and commitment. So, unless they trust you, or they're able to go ahead with the change, you might decide not to. So when we talk about in this paper that Stephen did, the macro, meso, and the micro, so when you look at the macro level, so what was the goal? To make the change. Okay. So, what were the methods? Okay. So how did you come to that decision? Yeah. So did I observe the player? Did I ask them? Did I measure them? Did I whatever? And then what were the methods that you used? So did I use psychological methods to try to make sure that when I was deciding that this was the goal, that they were on the same page as me, for instance? Yeah. So when you look at even technical training, your ability to implement that technical training is dependent on bio, psycho, and social factors. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it is complex, but we are getting there. And there is growing recognition, I think, and appreciation of, what we call applied and translational science now. So, there's a lot of stuff out there, and I think coaches just need to be very critical of the studies that they're reading to ask, does this apply? Okay, they've implemented this condition, but they've compared it against something that is totally unrealistic and not used in golf. Mm-hmm. So, of course, it makes their other condition look very good. If we compared it with good practice, might be worse, might be the same, or hopefully might be better. Yeah.
And I think that's where going back to setting the stage, I think that's, at least for the coaching perspective, setting from the beginning, the intake process or how you're communicating is very important. Setting that foundation of, yes, this is what we want to achieve, creating a long-term picture for the player, but then also saying, what does this mean? This is months of work. This is going to be difficult. Setting proper expectations is something. And if you don't do that at the beginning, it's hard because those expectations weren't there. And what I take for granted or assume to be the case is different than what a different person might assume to be the case about learning or skill development and how fast they're going to progress. And then there can be these conflicts. So I also think it's probably beneficial just from a long-term player development and client retention perspective to be on the same page. Because otherwise, if you realize you're saying, hey, this is going to take 4 months, and the player says, well, I want it done in 2 weeks, maybe it's not the client to be working with.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I speak to a lot of coaches, and I often ask them simple question. When you work with a golfer, what are you doing? Are you trying to change what they do? Or are you trying to change what they think they do?
Interesting.
And the answer is both. What you're seeing is what they do. And many coaches will correctly diagnose an ineffective movement pattern. That's what they do. But is that what they think they're doing? Or do they think that they're Tiger Woods? Because what the golfer thinks they're doing and how that translates to what they're actually doing is part of the problem. So making sure that the golfer is on the same page, not only in terms of how they understand their movement, if that's what you're trying to change, but also the expectation of what it takes and how they're going to do it, to change it, is really key. Shouldn't be underestimated.
Very important point. What they do versus what they think they do. So meaning what they think they need to actually be doing to get done what they want to achieve.
So how often do you show a golfer their swing on video and they go, oh my God, is that what I look like? Mm. I didn't realize my swing was that flat. I thought I was swinging it like this. And now you can see that there's a misunderstanding. So if you're on the lesson tee trying to communicate them to swing with a steeper swing plane, let's say, Well, if they think that they're doing what you're telling them to do, there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, making sure that what you're seeing and what they're seeing in their mind as what they're doing, it needs to be the same thing. And I think that a lot of golfers' problems are that they don't represent what they're actually doing. They go out to play golf thinking that they're something that they're not. They're moving in a way that they're not. Because I hear all the time, is that what I look like? It felt like I was doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, another point, we've gone off topic with the study, is to really develop that relationship. You know, as the coach, part of your role is to offer feedback, but making sure that the person is processing that feedback against their experiences is really key. It's interesting because you talk about theory to practice, you know, and you might assume that, coaches are implementing theory, but in a lot of their, rationalizing of what they did, particularly in the first study, they didn't refer to particular theories. They didn't say, I'm doing this because evidence says that this is better. So I guess we're at a stage where, they are using applied evidence. So based on my experience of successes or working with players, or what the players tell me, they're coming from a good starting point. And I think, which is good because that's where we're coming from a pragmatic point of view. Yeah, we're looking at the issues in front of us on the ground. But what we need to do is to sort of build momentum towards developing a more considered approach to training. And we can do that from this it depends perspective. It's not as easy as just telling somebody you should do that, because you've got to think about it. But I think that, coaches now and the culture in coaching is moving towards realizing this more nuanced perspective.
It depends.
It depends.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. This is where I share written, audio, and video content designed to help golfers take their game to the next level. All the relevant links from today's episode and to the newsletter can be found below. See you next time.